Overall, Sly Cooper and Thieves Raccoonus wasn't quite the major success Sucker Punch had hoped for. While it managed to get over 400,000 copies sold to get the greatest hits label, it wasn't anything compared to the first Ratchet & Clank, and reviews weren't terribly positive because of its short length and relatively easy difficulty. However, it still did well enough for Sony to give Sucker Punch the green light to make a sequel, and perhaps Sucker Punch realized they needed to try something new. A lot of people dismissed Sly 1 as a Crash Bandicoot lookalike, so Sly 2 sort of revamped the series by going into a more GTA sandbox style of gameplay. However, they didn't quite do it so much that they alienated fans of the first game. The sequel still made use of a lot of elements in the initial entry, and therefore felt more like an improvement over the original instead of a reimagining like Jak 2. In fact, I'd say Sly 2 has more in common with Ratchet & Clank 2 instead of the latter. It took the elements of Sly Cooper and Thieves Raccoonus and built them around a different context. Sly 2 Band of Thieves takes place right after the events of the first game. Sly and the gang are trying to steal the clockwork parts in order to keep him from coming back to life. Already you can see how Bentley and Murray have grown with their involvement in the heist. They're not just sitting in the van like before, now they're actively helping Sly. Unfortunately, they learned somebody already stole the parts, and now Sly and the gang need to make a global trek to track them down and take out the group that stole them in the first place, the Claw Gang. Sounds simple, right? Well, you'd think that at first. However, the story becomes very complex as it goes on. It's much more narrative-driven compared to the first game. The three Cooper gang members have grown substantially. While Sly initially started out as a darker character, now he's a bit funnier this time around, not being afraid to crack a joke once in a while. Kevin Miller reflects this with his more energetic and livelier performance.
This is Peking Duck. I hear you, Blizzard.
No, Sly, I'm the wizard, and you're sitting duck.
I read you loud and clear, Lizard.
Murray, on the other hand, is no longer a cute hippo. Instead, he has become a stronger and bulkier brute known as the Murray. Granted, he still has that charming gentleness to him. However, Sly 2 placed him in some situations that really shows his loss of innocence. At the end of episode 4, the Contessa pumps him with spice, which makes him deranged. Now, the Murray from Sly 1 wouldn't pose so much of a threat. The guy would get scared of the slightest flashlight guard. However, with his newfound strength, Murray is no longer weak, and Sly has no choice but to dodge his attacks to have him destroy the surrounding machines to break the Spice's control. Finally, there's Bentley, and he's the one I'd say goes through the most amount of character development. In the first game, he was mostly the one that provided Sly with all the helpful tips and hints on how to get a crack at the Fiendish Five. In Sly 2, his position has been elevated as someone in charge of all the planning. He's the one that creates all the preparatory tasks for the gang in order to pull off a heist. However, not only that, but he also gets to shine in the spotlight for once. When Sly and Murray are betrayed by Neela and taken to the Contessa, Bentley is the one that has to break them out. He has to rely on his wits to save his friends, and proves more than capable than meets the eye. It made the conclusion of the episode all the more satisfying, in which Sly and Murray recognized the value of Bentley beyond simply being the thinker, and to see what eventually happens to this guy is just heartbreaking. I won't spoil anything, but the near-death experience Bentley faces in the end really demonstrates just how much he's grown from the first game. Certain jobs Sly and Murray could not perform, and Bentley's willingness to put his life on the line really shows that he's more than just a turtle that frets all the time. While Sly 2 doesn't make him the main protagonist of this game, it does explore the most amount of dimensions with his character compared to the other two gang members. So the three protagonists of Sly, Bentley, and Murray feel much more fleshed out compared to the first game, and I can definitely say the same for the villains. In the original, the Fiendish Five felt separate, and none of them were really working towards a common goal. The Claw Gang, on the other hand, have much more in mind than just keeping the clockwork parts. They plan on using them as a means to ship illegal spice across the world. While it might not sound like much, it manages to make the Claw Gang feel like a more unified group instead of just a bunch of lowlives scattered across different areas. They're also much more competent than the Fiendish Five. In Sly 1, it felt very routine because you just fight them once and the Thieves Raccoonus page was yours. In Sly 2, the villains are much more adept. Neela and Contessa manage to humiliate Carmelita and to knock her off her pedestal as captain by deceiving the police that she was in cahoots with Sly. Jean Bisson manages to knock out the Cooper gang and steal all the clockwork parts. Whereas in the first game, the trio always felt like they could take a vacation after beating a Fiendish 5 member, Sly 2 had them constantly on their toes. While they all pose as major threats, Neela was the biggest danger with her manipulative nature. She manages to trick the Cooper gang into trusting her, which gets them arrested and deceives Interpol into making it look like she was the one that caught the Contessa, which raised her rank up to captain. Unfortunately, when her true colors were revealed, she started to lose some appeal as a character. She goes from being a sneaky deceiver to sort of a Saturday morning cartoon villain of the week.
You won't stop me! Not the Cooper gang, not Interpol, not anyone!
And then the way they have her merge as Clockla. Yeah, it's just downright goofy. It would have been much better to revive Clockwork because Clockla coming into being just feels so all of a sudden. It's like the writers just ran out of ideas with what to do with Neela and say, hey, let's just merge her with Clockwork. It'll be so cool. Honestly, it's pretty uncreative. And then the whole addition of a hate chip, like the whole intrigue with Clockwork as a villain is how he was able to keep himself alive for thousands of years fueled by hate alone. And then the game decides to just explain it away with a little hate chip. Granted, maybe Arpeggio added it when he was rebuilding Clockwork, but Sucker Punch was trying a little too hard with trying to explain certain aspects that didn't need explaining. Ironically, it made the Clockwork lore downright bizarre. But while the villains played a bigger role in the story, Carmelita almost seemingly took a bit of a back seat in the sense that she wasn't the cop on top of her game like in the original. Instead, she appears much more vulnerable with how she gets manipulated by Neela, and at times even has to rely on Sly. While in the first game, she was the one jumping onto the scene right when Sly was about to leave, here she finds herself fleeing the scene with him, so the situation is kind of reversed. She also gets to have her own time to actually connect with him at the end, which adds some form of a character development and moves the romantic relationship forward. So many of the relationships in media often end up falling into this will they, won't they scenario. But Sly 2 doesn't fall into this trap by developing the romantic tension between Carmelita and Sly beyond the little banters they exchange in a chase to a genuine conversation between the two. But I do have to address the elephant in the room, and that's Carmelita's new voice actress. She's now voiced by Alicia Glidewell instead of Roxanne Ortega. And for the most part, I'd say that it sounds fine. However, the voice change is rather jarring because Alicia Glidewell sounds nothing like Ortega. It's kind of funny because Carmelita's voice actress changes for each game. Thankfully, Glidewell for the most part puts up a solid performance. She's much more expressive and articulate compared to Ortega, who felt like she's not even trying, at times.
Well, 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 look who just walked into my crosshairs. Sly Cooper.
What's your name?
Why ruin the moment?
Huh? I don't understand.
The wings! What happened to the clockwork wings?
What? How? Who could have... What? Cooper!
But generally, Sly 2 makes major improvements in the story department. However, for the gameplay, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Now, Sly 2 is a real innovation in the sense it revamps the gameplay from a Crash lookalike to a more sandbox focus. The game involves accomplishing missions, which eventually accumulates to the gang pulling off a final heist. This prevents the missions from feeling random and gives the feeling of working towards something bigger. They involve pickpocketing for keys, sneaking up behind an individual to learn about some different information, and tearing down different rooms to find parts of a tuxedo. Of course, one of the big selling points for Sly 2 is that you get to play as Bentley and Murray, and here's where things get controversial. I'll admit that I found it really frustrating when navigating with them into hub worlds, because these areas just were not made for them. You're vulnerable to getting caught when wandering around the ground, so Sly's advantage of traversing the rooftops makes running around these worlds a bit of a pain with Bentley and Murray. This was especially the case with the last world, in which, because it takes place on a hover ship, it's hard for them to get around, whereas Sly can rely on the poles to ninja spiral jump from and rail walk on. Episode 4, The Predator Awakens, was also very hard, with all the trees and undergrowth that were clearly meant for Sly to climb all over. However, the arduous navigation doesn't destroy the fun of playing as Bentley and Murray, for the individual missions make different uses of their playstyles. Bentley's gameplay mostly involves him shooting darts and bombing them while they're asleep in a cloak and dagger way. However, his playstyle isn't limited to just that, as some of the missions will have him using his equipment in different ways. In one mission, Bentley has to use his sleep darts to create sound projections in order to lure the Claw Gang member Rajan to different watermelon in order to temporarily subdue him to steal the blueprints. Because Bentley is the least combat-oriented of the three, he needs to study the position of his surroundings so that he can lead Rajan around without catching the attention of the guards. He'll also be in charge of dispensing traps on enemies, and even faces off against Jean Bisson. Seriously, you'd think a boss like him would be reserved for someone like Murray, and technically you can fight him within his cabin in episode 6, but there's something charming about a little turtle like Bentley trying to take on someone twice his size. On the surface, maybe Bentley is still the turtle with the stuffy nose, but boy did Sucker Punch make him more than the nerdy guy who sits in the van stressing over Sly. As for Murray, his missions have him fighting with brute strength and using his muscles to navigate the level. He's a breath of fresh air from the stealth focus of Sly and Bentley, which makes his missions the most combat-heavy. Seriously, it's just so satisfying punching through waves of enemies with Sly while Bentley hacks a computer. What should have been a simple escort mission became very intense because of how many foes crowded his screen, which forces you to sometimes use power-ups. And speaking of which, Sly 2 has a nifty new feature known as Thief Nets to get special abilities. The abilities from here are much more useful compared to the ones you get from safes. The paraglider in particular was very good for traveling to far-off distances, which helped reach mission points in a faster time span. Sly also gets a smoke bomb added to his arsenal, and as ridiculous as that sounds, it's actually very useful for confusing enemies and throwing them off your tail when you're in the middle of a chase. I didn't really find myself using Bentley and Murray's power-ups all that often, but there are a couple worth mentioning. Murray's Turnbuckle launch was serviceable for getting up to higher ledges he couldn't normally reach. It does help him with being able to get a vantage point with the rooftops, so that he's not stuck on the ground all the time. His Fists of Flame were really useful when it came to dealing with crowds of enemies, because it would squelch them in one hit. As for Bentley, I guess being able to toss bombs at a long distance was an improvement over having to walk up to them, but I'll admit I did sort of neglect him when it came to using his special moves. These power-ups are very expensive to get, which is why Sly 2 has more ways to get money than just defeating enemies. Some of the guards have a little shine in the back of their pocket, which means Sly can pickpocket a special item from them. Of course, sometimes it takes a bit of digging, but the rewards are worth it, especially if you get multiple items at once. You can exchange them all at ThiefNet to get more coins for that paraglider. The other method involves the antique loot scattered across the world. Any of the characters can snag and return it to the safe house for lots of money. While you can do it with any character, you'd most likely do it as Sly because of how advantageous he is with the rooftops. While these are difficult since you're almost always guaranteed to get caught while getting back, they're well worth the challenge if you're up for it. Plus, they're a nice break from the main missions. The final thing I'd mention are the vehicle sections. Now thankfully Sly 2 does away with all the racing parts of its predecessor, but what they've chosen to replace them with is less than ideal. Sly 2 has a lot of turret sections. The most prominent feature about this is that you have to wait for your gun to cool down after firing for an extended period of time. Maybe this adds a bit of a challenge to parts like this, but it also leaves you open to getting attacked, therefore making this less satisfying. Sly 1 also had one section where you had to control a turret, and that didn't require you to wait for the gun to cool down. Here in Sly 2, it was a bit irritating with this new feature, especially since you have to take care of several things at once, like shooting down a dam while striking down enemy aircrafts and evading fire. Yeah, it's clear that these parts are just put in here for the sake of variety. On the other hand, there are the Bentley hacking minigames, which provides much more mobility and freedom and control. Basically, you run around as a little hacking avatar, shooting down barriers while avoiding and taking out crossfire that comes your way. Overall, these were actually a lot of fun, mainly because they forced you to think outside the box. If there are barriers covering 2 terminals, it's not smart sitting there and simply firing your gun. You'd have to do some multitasking of taking out the surrounding enemies while gradually chipping away at the force field. In a lot of ways, it's an endurance test that doesn't last too long to be excruciating, but at the same time feels like a decent challenge. But the open world isn't simply for the main missions. Sly 2 added one extra task in the form of the clue bottles. In order to better integrate them into the open world, the game gave a tip with how to find them. The player had to carefully listen to the clinking of the bottles to discover them. Granted, the reward you get from them continues to be rather useless, and considering the bottles are harder to find in the open world, I wouldn't say they're worth it. That being said, all those issues don't take away from the overall quality of Sly 2. There are quite a few people that like to complain about the fact that the addition of other characters took away from the overall experience, and maybe it was admittedly hard to navigate the open world with them, but for the most part, Sly 2 was a massive leg up compared to the original. Not only did it combine the elements of stealth and platforming, but it also added sandbox gameplay to the mix, so franchises like Assassin's Creed really owe a lot to the Sly Cooper trilogy. Sly 2 is the definitive sequel. It managed to innovate over the original without alienating its core audience. And honestly, you won't believe how many sequels don't seem to get this. It changed a lot, but it didn't go overboard with it. Therefore, I can safely conclude that Sly 2 is a game that is well worth playing to this day. Well, that really is something. It's not every day a sequel improves over the original. Wait, what? Go outside? How dare you trample on my rights? How dare you tell me what to do? How dare you—